Good morning. Thank you for coming to today's presentation on estimating. We have two presenters, John Hurren and Paul Lawrence. Both are builders, both are industry consultants, both are construction educators with a lot of experience. The presentation on estimating given by Paul and John is a breakdown of the discipline of estimating. John will give an overall presentation on how to put together an estimate and the things and processes that you must consider to ensure accuracy. Paul then will drill down further and look at a particular unit in estimating that a lot of people tend to forget. That is the covering of your overheads, the covering of your costs, and how you will then incorporate that into your list of the final figure that John Hurren will outline. Our first presenter, John Hurren.
Good morning. My name is John Hurren. I'm here to talk to you today about some of the fundamentals about estimating, from the quantity takeoff through to the estimate itself. Estimates start from a quantity takeoff and end in an estimate, and go on further to purchase orders and so forth as the job proceeds. I, like many of you, started my working career as an apprentice carpenter. I then moved on to things like supervision and subcontracting, and then when I got to the stage where I thought, I'm ready, I want to be a builder, I sought some advice from an old builder that I'd worked for in the past. And I went up to him and I asked him, made the statement that I wanted to be a builder, and I thought, could you give me some advice? And all I got in response was a question, you want to be a builder, eh? And during the conversations we had, he said that every building office has only got three important things, and that is good documentation, and good documentation. So he said, when you get to a point where you're actually estimating and doing a quantity takeoff, it's no different. You need to record meticulously everything that you do. His advice in part was as follows: always be sure of where you are headed. 2, always be sure of where you're at. And 3, always remember where you have been. Those comments were relating to not just estimating, but the way you would conduct your business. On point 1, he explained that you need to do meticulous estimating. Don't take shortcuts. Don't try and speed things up. Be accurate, methodical, and go from the beginning through to the end, recording everything as you go. He said accurately take off all the materials and labour, the quoted items, the contingencies, statutory fees and charges, holding charges and the overheads and profit. All of the things have to be accounted for within the estimate. With regards to the materials and labour, that is a fairly diverse area of any estimate. It can be unit rates or composite rates to make up your estimate. Your labour and materials come from various sources. So you could have a situation where you have labour-only suppliers, like subcontractors. You can have supply and fixed subcontractors. You can have suppliers that supply small amounts of materials, some that supply lots of materials. An example of quoted items would be things like your roof trusses, your roof tiles, your windows, fascia and gutter perhaps, those sorts of things that you would outsource quotes for. When we get into contingencies, they're things that you have to take account of that maybe happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen, but cover the cost of unknown things that could happen. Statutory fees and charges, quite clearly, they have to be accounted for, in as much as that the BSA just don't say, oh, well, I'm sorry, you might have forgotten to put the BSA fees in. Oh, don't forget next time, it's all right this time. You need to cover all of those costs. Holding charges mainly refers to things when you're actually building spec houses and the like, where you've got land tax and rates and insurances and so forth. Overheads and profit. do not underestimate your overheads. Overheads are one of the most important things to take consideration of, from the point of view that they can be ongoing costs irrespective of how much work you've got in progress. So you must take account of your overheads and profit.
John, can I ask, we be in a renovation that allowing a small percentage over the cost of the job for unforeseen structural changes, such as, you might have to put in new floor joists or new bearers. Absolutely. Or take stumps out, or even finding termite or water damage. Would that be an example of contingencies?
Absolutely. Those are the things that you may be suspicious about, or may think could happen, but there's no definite occurrence of them at the beginning.
So you might put aside a small percentage of that cost.
Put aside an amount to cover those contingency costs. Absolutely.
With a new house, what would be an example of a contingency? Do you think it would be allowance for, I don't know, crane hire or extra bins in rubbish removal?
That could be exactly the case. Different sites create those sorts of situations too. Zero lot alignments, where might have to get a crane to get something in that you didn't think you had to get in. Costs that occur that weren't originally budgeted on, but you really need to cover the possibility of it happening. Job costing too, this is digressing a little bit, but it has an impact on how you do your estimate and your takeoff. Job costing is where we actually compare the actual costs against the estimated cost, which is pretty vital during the running of the job. And why it's important at the estimating stage is it gets back to how you record and collate all of the information when you're taking off the quantities and putting it into the estimate. So we have to have some method where we can compare these costs. So we need to compare the cost of the actual cost of the foundation materials at the time the foundation is completed, because if you wait until the end of the job to compare these costs, you never have an opportunity to recover any lost monies. So in fact, everyone makes a mistake. With estimating, you can have three of the major things that can cause overruns is underestimation of the cost, the use of more materials than you accounted for, and time factors can take a toll on the actual outcome of the job. So as far as job costing is concerned, you really need to start from the beginning and work your way through. So we put a cost centre to each part. So foundations might have a cost centre of 3. You move on to something else like carpentry might have a cost centre of 7. So when you take off your quantities, you have to put them in an order whereby you can then relate the actual cost back to that, cost centre. The earlier you identify an overrun on cost, the more opportunity you have to recover that cost at a later date through the process of the job. You might get cross quotations from different suppliers and so forth to see if you can reduce the amount of loss if you do find that you've overrun on a certain part. That gets us back to know where exactly you are at all times through the project. Just don't start it and go from beginning to end. You must know how things are stacking up as you go along. Manage your cash flow. Another important issue relates to how the job progresses. And remember, not a single saving can be made once the job is completed. So it all relates to how you take off your quantities.
John, could I ask, when you say know exactly where you are at all times through the project, would you relate your takeoff and your costings to some form of scheduling graph?
That's one way. I would do like your budget. You can break your job budget down, and that all relates back to your cost centres as well. So that as you print out or summarise all of your costs, you can then compare the actual creditor's invoices to those costs as you go. And this is a pretty important point number 3 that he pointed out to me. He explained that historical records are a wonderful resource. Not every job's exactly the same, but parts of lots of jobs are the same. So if you have good historical records, and this gets back to your job costing, if you can open up that information and refer to it at any time in the future, then you have a great resource there with help when you're doing estimating in the future, particularly when you're relating to things like labour costs. What do? Do you sit down with a pencil and paper and say, oh, that'll take me 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to do something? And that's a very legitimate method of working out how much time you need to spend on these jobs as far as the labour component is concerned. But as far as the historical records go, if you've got a job that's similar to one you've done before, it's very, very useful to be able to go back to that information recorded and compare it so that you can use that information in a new estimate that you might do. I, in fact, did a time and motion study on myself when I first started to produce my estimating software, and I timed myself on every task that I undertook, whether it be laying out bearers and joists or fabricating wall frames, and I related that back to a metre rate so that I can use that within composite rates as I built them at a later stage. I did that on 2 or 3 jobs, and then I had the ability to take the average or the most time-consuming parts of the job and relate those back to a task. Recording of invoices now, you might say that's got nothing much to do with estimating, but it really does have an impact on how the actual costs compare to the estimated costs. And don't be afraid to adjust your methods of estimating as you go along. Experience is a wonderful thing. You can be taught in a classroom about methodologies, but experience is really the thing that teaches you the most.
With historical records, your opinion on builders using books out there like Cordell's or Rawlins's that have all this data for quoting jobs, is that something that would be worthwhile? Or?
Absolutely, for certain parts of the job, there's no question about that. For example, even in domestic construction, you might have a situation where it's got a set of concrete stairs and you've never ever done those before. Cordell's is a wonderful resource for looking up the cost of those things to get to make sure you've covered your costs. My experience with those products that are available is that it really does, in certain circumstances, have an effect on your competitiveness. Their rates tend to cover all the costs to the worst case scenario, which is not a bad approach, provided you can secure a job. But the bottom line of the thing is you've got to be able to secure the job. Mind you, once you secure the job, you don't want to be losing money on it either. We're not doing it for the exercise.
What about the big one where builders would use a square metre rate?
I'm going to cover square metre rates, and that's one of my pet hate square metre rates. Clearly, you could take a multi-million-dollar house or a very inexpensive house, and you could relate a square metre rate to something. 1 square metre of plasterboard ceiling in both houses could cost exactly the same amount of money, but it doesn't relate to the overall cost of the houses. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So don't be afraid to adjust your methods when you're estimating, and that's from your experiences. When I come to estimating, this builder that I admired very much said the 3 most important things about the estimate in a simplified statement is as follows. He said the estimate has to be fast to prepare. It has to be quick to prepare because you don't get every job that you tender on. And I'm speaking from the perspective of being a competitive builder here, not just a subcontractor. But you have to have the ability to produce an accurate estimate as quickly as you possibly can. When I first started contracting, what I did was I meticulously took off the timber list, right down to soffit battens, every single part, to the last screw that was needed for the doors, hinges, locks, everything, collated them perfectly, costed them up or sent those quantities out to be quoted. It came back, and with a great feeling of satisfaction, I arrived at my contract price, put in my tender to the prospective client, only to find that the accepted quote was around about what my net costs were. And it didn't take me long to figure out that I had to have a way of accurately coming up with a cost without spending laborious hours working out every nut, bolt, screw and hinge in the house. And I'll cover that in more detail as we move along. Estimating, he said, the first step is it has to be quick. And I found out very early in my contracting career that that was the case. The second thing is very, very obvious. Second thing about estimating is it's got to be accurate. And it's got to be accurate because if you get the job, the whole purpose is to make a profit and not to lose money. It's got to be accurate. And the third thing is the estimate has got to be understandable. And I cannot stress this part of the estimating process more strongly. The estimate has to be understandable because as your business grows and you introduce perhaps a supervisor, he has to be able to take what you've produced in your quantity takeoff and your estimate and put that into practice on the job. So he needs to take what you've done, have a total understanding of it, and then proceed in a fashion that's going to be profitable and complete the project in a timely manner. The other point about it being understandable is that as you're progressing through the project, your memory might be clouded by several jobs you've got in progress at the same time. You need to be able to have some sort of hard copy to which you can refer to refresh your memory about the way you'd actually undertake your estimate. Quantity takeoff and estimating is important no matter how big the job is. It doesn't matter whether you're putting up a fence for Mrs. Smith down the road. Just don't take a guess at what it's worth to do the job. The quantity takeoff has to be done in a fashion which can be followed, understood and costed properly. You must take into account everything, even the smallest jobs you have to take into account things like fees and charges, establishment costs, labour costs, material costs, overhead costs and perhaps even ongoing maintenance with some jobs. In addition to that, of course, you can't forget your profits. Just give you a brief definition of what I'm talking about when I speak of quantity takeoff and estimating. This is where we break our estimate into two parts. The quantity takeoff part is to do with the taking off of all of the materials that's required for the job. It's the act or process of measuring and quantifying what is required to complete the project, everything that's in that project. The estimate is the act of costing all that had been quantified during the takeoff process, including the costing of statutory fees and charges, labour and materials, overheads and holding charges, contingencies, maintenance and profit. If it's got to be costed, it has to be taken off. Don't leave it to memory. A house consists of more than just labour and the materials. You have to take in consideration all of the things relating to that particular job. All documents relating to the estimate need to be meticulously collated and recorded for future reference. This is vital. Don't rely on your memory. You might remember things, but do you remember it in the detail in which you meant it to be done? Irrespective of the method employed, when you're doing your estimate, whether it's manually done or by computer, it must be done in a logical fashion. Don't pick up the plan, look at it and say, oh, it's got a tile roof, I'll cost that. Work in a process from beginning to end. Build the house in your mind as you do the quantity takeoff. It's got to be understood, and it can't be understood unless it's in a logical process. It's got to start at the beginning and end at the end. Don't get parts mixed up.
John, can I ask a question? Just on that very last statement of yours, do you feel that's one of the greatest problem areas where people who are doing a takeoff for an estimate get waylaid? And they go away, then or they see an easy part and they start jumping around. As a professional estimator, is there anything, any one tip that you would give to an up-and-coming builder to say, all right, when you sit down to do a takeoff, would it be shut the door, turn the phone off? What would it be?
All of the above. In fact, I was a draftsman supervisor with Kernbill Homes when they were in Townsville many, many years ago. And in fact, they saw the role of the quantity surveyor and estimator to be so important that in the back of their workshop, they had a container, air-conditioned, phone, lights, and the quantity takeoff person was in there, the quantity surveyor was in that building. You couldn't get in there. It only had a deadlock on it. It could be entered by a key. You couldn't open the door. That's how important they thought that role was. Similarly with the estimator. And I can remember when I was supervising with them, if you purchased one piece of material that wasn't on that quantities list, you had to explain why. You couldn't simply say, oh, it was cut short. Well, in that case, it's the subcontractor's got to replace a piece of timber. Oh, it was bent. Well, in that case, the supplier's got to replace a piece of timber. You don't just go out and deviate from the costing in any shape or form. You stick with the quantities, you stick with the cost. Otherwise, the profit disappears.
For many builders that we are going to talk to through this product, a lot of us work from home. So where we can't work in a container, how can we ensure that we are going to get accuracy when we're working from a home office?
Well, it all gets down to how you record things. Interruptions are inevitable, particularly if you're a sole trader. You're it. You're the quantity surveyor, estimator, builder, father, husband. You might even be the cook and bottle washer in the house. You have to break the job down. This is the other important thing about, I spoke before about breaking the job down into logical steps. If you look at it as an overall, I'm going to start now and finish now, then you can't have interruptions. If you break it into sections, if you say, well, tonight I'm going to take off the foundations and slab, get that out of the road. The amount of interruptions that are going to happen in that part of the job are going to be few. If there is an interruption, you think, oh, we'll have to start again. Well, you're only starting again on that part, not on the entire project. So it gets down to method.
The second point there, you've got quote value or contract price. When you're doing an estimate, is there any difference between estimating for a quote and estimating for a contract price?
When you're talking from a subcontractor's perspective, no, the process I would put into place would be exactly the same.
Okay, so if I was to do a quote as a subcontractor, I've got to take off, I've got to do the whole estimate, no shortcuts, no, might go back to my square metre.
That's a very important point, because that's where you start your estimating, you start building up your knowledge about estimating as whilst you're a subcontractor. Different builders work in different ways. Like take, for example, a subcontract carpenter who comes to, or answers an advertisement, subcontracted carpenters wanted. So as you go up there, they might say, the builder might say, here's the plan, here's the price, do you want the job? It becomes very simple. You look at it and you think, no, I can't do it for that amount of money, or yes, I can do it for that amount of money. You might get another builder who will say, here's a plan, tell me how much you think this job is worth to do. In which case, then you have to sit down and figure out all of the tasks you've got to undertake in the scope of the works, record them meticulously and put a time next to each, total it up, multiply it by a charge out rate, and then you can come up with a price. So it is very similar, it's probably less work in the overall approach to estimating, because in one instance you're doing simply just costing up the labour, whereas the other you're costing up the entire project. But the approach should be similar. Here are a few points to ponder. Don't take shortcuts when you're doing your estimating. I can't stress that more importantly. Don't fall into the trap of using a cover-all square metre rate when estimating. Square metre rates can and do vary from one job to the other. In fact, years ago, I was in a very competitive market and I was competing with other builders, a lot of whom I knew, in the local area. I'd have people phone me up and say over the phone, how much a square metre do you charge? And I said, it's your lucky day. I'm probably the only builder that can tell you to the cent how much a square metre your house is going to be worth. Oh, what is it? And I said, well, firstly I've got to build it. So once I've completed it, I can tell you precisely how much a square metre it is. But until it's completed, no one can. You can estimate and calculate the best of your ability, but no one can work on a square metre rate. And I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a few moments. I keep stressing this point about being logical in your approach. Most important. Record it. Take it in a process. Give each process its own cost centre and work from there to the very end. Go into lots of detail on your takeoff sheet and your costings. Transfer that cost of that particular part of the project into your summary sheet so that it can be totaled up at a later date to work out your fees and charges. Seek clarification on any ambiguity in the plan. Don't just assume, oh, no, I'll do this. If it's something that's a little bit odd, you should go back to the client and say, well, look, you know, this is what's asked for here. I don't think that's wise, or I don't think I can do that because of this reason. In fact, on your plan, Damien, it shows a frameless window. And when you take the last point of support to the outside of the gable fascia board, you've got 1.5 metres of unsupported roof load. What did I do when I costed it? I rang Damien and said, listen, mate, what are we going to do with this? And we come to a logical agreement that was structurally sound, and that's what we did. So if you see something that's odd, measurements don't add up, or things like that, go back to the source of the plan, because ultimately it's his responsibility. Once you deviate, you accept responsibility for it. Now, when outsourcing quotes, and you're going to have to do this, like if you get a house, you might be able to get rates from roof suppliers and truss suppliers, but you can't simply accept that the price that you calculate on their behalf is going to be perfect, particularly with things like roof trusses. I might say, oh, allow so much a square metre. Well, I mean, is it a type A truss or a type B truss? I mean, that's a very, very dangerous method of estimating. You're better off outsourcing a quote for that specialised work. So the first thing I did in my process when I received a plan, say I received more than one plan in a week, I would prioritise the plans in the order in which I wanted to build them and whether I was likely to get the job. I didn't spend a lot of time costing up a house that I didn't think I would get. The first thing I did was I'd get the plan, I'd make several copies, even if it was just a photostat of the floor plan and a couple of elevations of the roof for the roof truss people. And I'd send out copies of the plans to Monia or Southside Roofing, depending on whether it was a tile roof or an iron roof. Get quotes on those. I'd get the window rep to call by and work out the cost of or a quote for the windows. Roof trusses, I'd outsource that. And that's what I do first up, is outsource all those quotes. And don't be afraid to change your methods of estimating to suit the way you build. There's no sense designing a method of estimating and then saying, I'm going to stick with this even though you know it's got some problems. Be prepared to change your methods. Materials change, regulations change, your quantity takeoff and estimate should change to suit the times.
John, can I just go back to your point with the window on Damien's plans? As a builder, I have a set of plans, and the plans have come from an architect, which I'm quoting for. It's a very simple domestic dwelling. On the plans, it indicates a stove in STV, indicates a sink, indicates a tub, as in the laundry tub. Now, I'm old school as a builder. Yes, I would provide a sink and a hot plate and a stove and a laundry tub. But on these particular plans, it also has the word, or it has REF for refrigerator. It has DSH for dishwasher, has a microwave, has a washing machine. Now, I can't see anywhere, it doesn't give me any details on the sink or the hot plates, but as a builder I would normally supply them. Doesn't give me any details on the fridge or the dishwasher or the washing machine, but as a builder I wouldn't supply them. It just doesn't happen. So I've got these plans. What should I do? There's no indication that says it's a provision for a dishwasher. It just says DISH. Do I allow for it because it looks the same as the sink, which I would allow for with SINK drawn in? What's your...
Well, I suppose that gets back to what I said before about if there's any ambiguities. You could say, well, what does it mean? That would be the first question I ask myself. Does the DIS mean provide provision for it? Do I need to put plumbing and electrical and drainage in there? Or does it mean that the cabinet maker only has to leave space for that particular thing? So if there's no specification that comes with the plan and there's no scope of works that comes with the plan, then I would simply cost the dishwasher but put a PC value or a provisional sum in for the dishwasher. The advantage about that is that if you've lost your competitive edge because you've included all of these things where your competition hasn't, then you need to be able to strip those values out of your quote to get an apple-to-apple comparison with the end cost. So that's a very important thing, and if in doubt, seek further information and document it the way you're going to do it. There's no sense in saying to a client, oh, I think I put the dishwasher in, or I think I put the range hood in, immediately credibility is damaged. And I can remember, pardon me, I can remember years ago I used to tender against a bloke down in the Redlands, and the client would have an appointment with me, and he had a sign out the front say, bring us your plan and we'll give you a quote on the spot. So that's what they did on their way to meet me. I walked in, gave him the plan, he took it out the back, got his calculator out, and 10 minutes later he come back and said, oh, I can do it for X amount of dollars. And of course they moved on to me and they said, oh, could you give us your price? And I said, look, you'll have to come back next week. I'll have to get some quoting done on this and I'll have to do the estimate. And they said, oh, so-and-so down the road did it in 5 minutes. And I said, well, he must be using a square metre rate. And immediately I'd go into my spiel about why square metre rates don't work. And I give them a couple of examples why that won't work. But to answer your question regarding these things that are marked on the plan, if there's any doubt in your mind about it, seek advice from the client. Do you want me to provide provision only for the dishwasher, or do you just want the space left for a mobile dishwasher, for example, which mightn't need any plumbing or anything? Or do you want me to allow a cost for it? One of the disadvantages about asking the client, it then throws them into a panic about going to find out which dishwasher they want to buy. You create an awful lot of additional work for a job you might never build. If you feel the client would want a dishwasher, I would then put the price into the estimate as a provisional sum for the installation of it, or a PC value if I was just going to put the plumbing and all of the utilities in for that particular product that I wasn't going to supply. Well, you might say, why don't you estimate using a square metre rate? In this example I've just got up here, we've got two houses and they're both constructed in a similar fashion. They're low-set brick veneer houses on a slab. You've got hip roofs, concrete tiles. House A is 10 metres by 10 metres, that's 100 square metres, with a perimeter of 40 metres. House B is 20 metres by 5 metres, it's 100 square metres, so for all intents and purposes both these houses are exactly the same size. The only difference is House B has got 50 metres of perimeter, where House A has got 40 metres of perimeter. Now how can that be important? Well, if you look at House B, it's got 22.32% more fascia, gutters and soffit than House A. It's also got 25% more foundation, external brick veneer, external wall frame than House A. those houses could not cost the same amount of money. So in fact, if you had costed a house up that was 10 metres by 10 metres, divided the cost by the area, and then multiplied that cost by the area of house B, you would be losing money. You couldn't possibly build those two houses for the same amount of money. In fact, do the exercise for yourself. Cost up a house that's 65 square metres and a house that's 200 square metres. When you've got the costs sorted out, divide each of the costs by the rate, and you'll find that the small house is way, 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 way more expensive per square metre than the 200 square metre house. I'll give you another example. Say you've got two houses that are 150 square metres. They're exactly the same. One's got a solar hot water system and security screens and the other doesn't. That can adjust the cost per square metre by about $10 a square metre. Throw into the mix things like two-pack kitchens, granite bench tops. It can change the cost immensely. I can remember years ago we built an art centre, and it was just a hall with a couple of little rooms at one end of it. Now if I applied a square metre rate to that, it would have been way cheaper than what our quote was, because it's got nothing inside. I'll relate to you a story when I built a spec house once. It was a display home, and off it we sold 3 houses exactly the same. One of the houses we built, the floor plan was the same, it had the same wardrobes and everything. The display home had sliding vinyl doors in the robes. The contract house, the first contract, had Western red cedar louver doors bifolded in all of the wardrobes. And I said to the painter, to be fair to him, I said, I've got a house I want you to give me a quote on. And he said, oh, what sort of a house is it? I said, it's the same layout as the display home, but you better go and look at it. So we went down and he walked through and he rang me back and he said, that's exactly the same. I said, are you sure? He said, yes. And I said, well, what's your price? He said, I'll do it for the same money. So he had to paint about 30 louver doors because he worked on the square metre rate. The first house he didn't paint the 30 louver doors. The second house he did. How could it possibly cost the same money? Square metre rates have their purpose. You can work square metre rates for concrete slabs, but you can't work it for the entire overall all-in cost per square metre for a house. Too dangerous process. Now this is getting more into the quantity takeoff area here, where we've got the cost codes and cost centres. The process is to give method and to be able to collate all of our costs. So in fact, if we say that we're going a cost centre of 4 to do with concrete, then we have to break that cost centre down into subsections to cover things like concrete, reinforcing labour, etc., so that we've got an orderable breakdown for the jobs, because we buy concrete from one supplier and we buy reinforcing from another, but it all relates to the one actual task. So cost centres are most important from that point of view. They don't have to be complex. They don't have to be complex. They only have to be logical. So you can use a normal basic numbering system. You might say 1 is site works, 2 is excavation, 3 is reinforcing, 4 is concrete, and so on. And I'll give you an example that comes from my computer program here. Now you'll see there on the right-hand side, that could be easily a summary sheet in a manual system. Instead of having the control letter, which is to do with the way the computer program works, we could have a money column there where we subtotal all of the costs, and at the bottom we could add on things like all our fees, charges and so forth, like the BSA fees, Q leave and so forth. That sort of process can be used in a manual system. We'll drill down a bit further now. So when you look at cost centre number 1 there, or cost code number 1 is preliminaries I've got in this instance, 2 is excavation, so forth. Let's have a closer look at the preliminaries cost centre when it's broken down further. If you look up there, you'll see preliminaries got a cost centre of 1.00, and then under that we've got 1.10, 1.20, 1.30, 1.40, and so on. And each of those are then broken down even further. So within engineering, which is a subheading of preliminaries, I've got things like soil test and foundation design and footing inspections, etc. That gives a logical approach to your estimating. Each one would represent a task, and each of those cost codes would represent what goes on a purchase order. Does anyone have any further questions about that? And you'll see just there at the very bottom, excavation, it goes to 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. So whatever the code is, the integer value of each of the codes relates back to the actual cost centre. Another vital part of doing quantity takeoff is to determine your units of measurement. How does this quantity, what is it for, a dozen or an hour or a month or a week or a lump sum figure? So you'll see there, like there's a couple of really good, well, there is an official document called the Australian Measurement. That's what it's called. And it's far more elaborate than this. This is what I used in my estimating when I was contracting, and found that to be quite adequate for the way I operated. And they have these abbreviations, M for metre, meaning that's a lineal measurement, anything that's measured by the length. Then you've got the square metre, cubic metre for volumes, square metres for areas, number is for the counted items, like how many passage doors are there, so there'd be passage doors number, so and so. Then you've got hour, and I could easily use number for the labour as well, but I use hour because that immediately triggers in my brain. It's to do with a time factor to do with labour. And item, which is my lump sums, PC items, contingencies, prime cost items, provisional sums and so forth. Anything that's a lump sum. Even when I outsource for things like roof trusses or concrete roof tiles, that would go into my estimate as an item because it represents a lump sum value. And the other reason why I use that is because item in my software has certain algorithms attached to it, so it manages that information within the estimate in its own specific fashion. So units of measurement, don't record anything in a quantity takeoff sheet unless it has a unit of measurement on it. Most important. It's got to relate to one of them. So if it relates to one or the other, record what it is. Now when we talk about units of measurements, we have unit rates and composite rates. And a unit rate is a cost per unit for plant, labour and materials. The unit rate is used in conjunction with the quantity required to ascertain the cost of the specific item being costed. So you've got the quantity, the unit, the rate, and extended through to the cost. So you really need to know what that rate applies to. For example, in a unit rate system, it relates to the actual cost of the single item, where a composite rate might relate to several items within the composite rate, and I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. Now, say for argument's sake, you were costing up 2048-20 passage doors. You'll give it its cost centre here on the screen, you'll write its description down, quantify it, record its unit of measurement, and because it says number, we know it's to do with how many there are. So we multiply quantity by the rate to end up with the cost. And that's how I would record unit rate costs within a manual estimating system. And it's done very similarly within my computer software as well. So unit rates relate to the single individual items that you purchase. Let's move on to a composite rate. Now what a composite rate is, if you like, you can look at a composite rate as being a mini estimate. What we've done with this particular composite rate here is I've costed up what all of the costs I want to be included in it as if it was a single task. All of the componentry I need. So I give a description of what's included at the top. I've got jambs, stops, architraves, doors, hinges, screws, latch, lock, keeper, catch, so on, right through to how much plasterboard is displaced by the door and how much skirting is displaced by the door. Now you don't have to have those things in, but getting back to what I was saying before about the speed of estimating, it relates to how you take the information or do your quantity takeoff from the plan. Now for example, say I had a wall that was 3.6 metres long and it had a passage door in it. When I do my quantity takeoff, I measure the 3.6 metres of the door. I don't measure up to the door and not deduct the door. What I do is I take the whole lot, then when I put the door into the estimate, it takes off the skirting and the plasterboard that's displaced by the door. Computer programs have a lot of power in that regard. If you were doing a composite rate by hand, say you've got Excel and you want to build up one of these composite rates to tell you what the value is so that you can use the rate within your estimate, that's a very legitimate way of doing it too, but you might not need to put those negative values in there. You'll see plasterboard I've got minus 3.654 metres, and for the skirting I've got minus 1798, which is two 900mm pieces of skirting that's displaced by the door, because an internal wall would have skirting on both sides. Does anyone have any questions about that composite rate? The big advantage about a composite rate is I don't have to worry about the carpenter's charge out rate for that door. I've devised a rate there and I say the carpenters are getting paid $55 an hour and I'm allowing 1.1 hours to do that. Now you might say, gee, that's a lot. I'd like to work for you, $55 an hour, plus I get an hour and 1.1 hours to do it. Well, calm down a bit. The 1.1 hours relates to putting in the lintel, the trimmer head across the top of the lintel, straightening the hinge side jambs, fixing the jambs, hanging the door, fitting the lock, fitting the architraves, fitting the latch, lock, stop, etc. That's the entire task. They mightn't all happen at the same time, but I've covered the cost of all of them and all the materials. That's the power of a composite.
John, does that then, where you've got carpenter's labour there, you've included a whole lot of things which includes the framing labour.
This is an excellent question.
Fixing the door, and then you might have someone else come in and do
Absolutely.
do the lock. So I really can't then take that labour as and go and write out a work order for a fixing carpenter to go and hang a door, because it includes other things as well.
I think that this is where computer software and a manual system digress. And it's a very, very good question you've asked. In a manual takeoff system, I would be doing my labour as a separate one-off task. In an estimating system such as Buildercost, it has the power to be able to take from any composite rate in which labour might be involved and put all that labour and collate it all together. That gets back to the cost centre. Now, within a composite rate, like a unit rate has a single cost centre, where a composite rate would have a multitude of items that have different cost centres. And once the estimate is completed, the software simply grabs all the same cost centres from different composite rates and puts them all together. But to answer your question, how would I manage it with a manual system? I would have a list, I'd have a composite, I beg your pardon, I would have a cost centre for labour, and within that cost centre I'd break it down to every task that I had in the job, and I'll put a time next to it. And that's what I would do. Lots of companies, however, would say, look, we only pay X amount of so many dollars a square metre. And they might break it down into first fix and second fix. They might say, oh, we've got framing gang, we've got a finishing gang, and we've got a soffit gang, and so forth. And they would have certain rates for each of those. But there's a multitude of ways of doing it. But in a manual system, I don't think you could deviate from listing, giving a cost centre for carpenter's labour and then breaking it down into every task you had to undertake. By far the most accurate way. Computers have a great ability to do things very, very quickly. They have to be identified quite clearly. So you'll see that that's by far not a complete composite rate. I mean, I could put in there things like painting of the door also. But I don't, because I use a different method for painting. Most of the people still use a square metre rate, but then add on to that square metre rate any specific thing that might be over and above what it would be considered normally covered by that square metre rate. But the composite can contain anything you like. An interesting thing, and this is leading into what I'm coming up to now, is rounding of quantities. Yeah, so that's your composite rate. So down the bottom down here, you'll see a lump sum value for that composite rate of $192.84. So let's see how that compares with a unit rate. If we just go back here, and you see this unit rate is for the cost per unit of the doors. So basically in that particular example there, we're only costing the doors. Whereas in this example here, we're costing not just the doors, we're costing all of the associated materials that come with the doors. Now if we move on to the next one, you'll see up the very top there, whereas the same process of entering into your quantity takeoff sheets, I've given it a cost centre and I've given it its description. I've got the same quantity. Now the cost centre has got its own unit of measurement, but the rate has changed to $192. Anyway, that's basically how that would work. The big advantage about estimating with composite rates, and when I say using composite rates, by no means do I mean only use composite rates. Your estimate can consist of unit rates and composite rates, and by all means it must, otherwise you can't handle quoted values and the like.
How would a builder, we're going through and we're putting all this together, how would you as a building professional pick up an error through the process? Or is there some sort of method that you would suggest or put forth to the people to say, look, here's a great example of a mistake, how do we pick it up and not pass it on to the client and have to wear it later on?
Look, that's a pretty important question. And do you know one of the biggest sources of error in quantity takeoff and estimating is the transposition of the number from a calculator to the hard copy. In other words, you might get a calculator and it might come up with a figure that says $192.50. They read it as $192.50 and write it down as $19.50. Check as you go. Get someone else to check it as you go. Check and double check. In fact, when I was an apprentice, I had an old Latvian builder that was a carpenter on the site with me. And I cut him a noggin one day and I threw it up to him and he threw it back at me and says, "Too short." And he stood up there, stamped his foot on the plank and says, "Measure it twice and cut it once," was his argument. Same story here. Measure it and check it. Get someone else to check it.
Point here is, as an estimator with a family builder or a large builder, no matter what area that you're addressing, estimating, the key issue here is discipline. That is going back over everything and be disciplined to do the same thing, same time, the same checking process to eliminate any errors or discrepancies. Would that be right?
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. With computer systems, it's less of a problem. It's only your input values that you can mess up. So if you can reproduce what you've input and compare those to your hand takeoff sheets, then you've got a very quick method of comparing it. You can rest assured that the computer's not going to make a mess up between extending the cost out from the quantity and the rate. But in manual systems, there is no excuse. Methodology and a logical process are the most important things. If you predetermine what's going to go onto your quantity takeoff sheet, whether you prepare the quantity takeoff sheet with something like Excel or whatever, you can always go back and add new lines in, add new items in. It's best to have a quantity takeoff sheet that goes out to 30 pages that prompts you from the list to refer to the plan for the quantity. And my process used to be, use the takeoff sheets as a prompt list, refer from the prompt to the plan to quantify the quantity, transfer the quantity back to the takeoff sheet. Now when that was finished, I then used to go to the plan, look over the plan and refer back to the quantity takeoff sheet. Now where that's important is, I'll give you one good example. Say for argument's sake, hitherto you hadn't had a skylight in your quantity takeoff sheet. If you're using the quantity takeoff sheet as your prompt list and then refer to the plan, it's not going to tell you to look for the skylight. But going back the other way, once you've done the quantity takeoff using the the takeoff sheet is your prompt list. Then you go to the plan, look over every part of the plan, say skylight. Oh, hang on, I haven't got a skylight, and you go back and amend your quantity takeoff sheet to include the item that to that point hadn't been used. It doesn't matter whether it's an inbuilt fireplace that you'd never had in the house before, or air conditioner that you've never put in before. Those things should be added to the quantity takeoff sheet to make it a definitive list. And then if it works in this progression from the beginning to the end, you're less likely to leave things out. So up the top up there should be 192.84. That's how you would cost using a composite rate. The big advantage about computer systems as opposed to a manual system is that once you put that piece of information there, it extrapolates that information out to the nth degree. So it will not only take the costing, but it will work out things like your purchase orders, budgets, and all of those things directly from the input you've put into your estimate to start with. What you see here is actually the costing using that one composite rate. What I've done is I've taken the composite rate and I've put a quantity of 7 in there and asked the computer to tell me how it costed that information out. Now you'll see up the very top right hand corner there, you've got a total value of $1,349.88, $1,349.88 multiplied. So we've got a rate of 192.84 or whatever it is, multiplied by 7 extended to the cost. But when you come down here, you'll see the value down at the bottom down here is actually more. And why that is more is because the quantities in the process of creating that bill of quantity has rounded to the purchasable quantity that's required to buy that particular item. Now, for argument's sake, in a composite rate for an internal wall, for example, it would have skirting on both sides of the wall. I'm entering into the system 3.6 metres of wall, taking that one wall as in isolation. You don't buy skirting in 3.6 metre lengths. You buy it in 5.4 metre lengths. So what the computer does is it rounds. So if it comes across a piece of skirting in a 3.6 example I've showed you, it'll give you a total of, 7.2 less the opening, which is more than one length. So it will round up to 2, because that's the way I've got to buy it. Now, it doesn't do that at the individual assembly, it does it at the end. So it collates all of the skirting. So, for example, if the skirting on around the walls were 42 by 12 bullnose and the architraves were the same, it collates and pulls all that information together and rounds once at the end. Takes the total metres you want and rounds it up. But rounding is another important issue. Just as a side, because I've embedded into that previous composite rate how I need to buy the materials, the software will actually give you a cutting list directly from the composite rate. So once you've built your entire estimate using all sorts of composite rates, it puts all like items together and pumps out a cutting list for you. So that's just an aside, which is very good because it's the metre rates that we're using in our costing because we're buying that material per metre, which is back to the unit rate. So it pulls the unit rates out of the composite rate and costs in that fashion. This is only a tiny piece of takeoff sheet. When I do an estimate, I might have 20 takeoff sheets, depending upon the size of the house. I might have, as little as 6 takeoff sheets for composite rates, and I might have 5 sheets for unit rates, or even less. This particular one here is a takeoff sheet for composite rates. So if I wanted to buy an entry door, I would describe it, put its unit of measurement in, identify it, that's mainly the assembly ID, and the quantity of them I need. So that's simply how I would do it. Use the takeoff sheet as a prompt, go to the plan, get the quantity, record the quantity ready for input or costing. This one here is for unit rates, and this is where I put in lump sums or things that are not in composite rates. I don't necessarily put a gull lintel with every window composite rate, for example, because not every window has a gull lintel over the top of it. So I put those things in as unit rate. So I quantify them and say how many I need, record it, and because it has a unit rate attached to it, it will cost it in that fashion. And when it comes to timber, I can actually put the cut lengths, so I can input those straight into the system. And it's no different when you're doing a manual system. All you would simply do is record them and cost them out by the unit rate. I'll just cover in a bit more detail rounding and waste and takeoff methods here. The rounding process is important to consider when doing a quantity takeoff because it's going to have an effect, particularly using composite rates, on how much material is needed to be ordered. Take this very, very simplistic floor plan I've got here, like a slab layout. It's got an area of 150 square metres and a perimeter of 50 metres. Now, for example, to just give you an idea of rounding, here I've got a calculation on those quantities that I've just shown you there. Like with the perimeter of 50 metres, if I wanted to calculate out the trench mesh, if there was 2 layers of trench mesh in those foundations, for example, 50 metres divided by the cover of the sheet. Now, you might have a different method of doing this. You might simply say, oh, I take the overall metres, I divide it by 6 because that's how I buy them. I buy the trench mesh sheets in 6 metre lengths and then add on a waste factor which would cover, you know, your laps and any waste that might take place. I take a slightly different approach here. I simply look at the cover is going to be of the actual product and use that for my calculation. So if we've got 50 metres of trench divided by 5.5 metres, because 6 metres less 500 lap gives you 5.5 metres cover, multiplied by 2, gives us 18.18 lengths of trench mesh. Now, because I can't purchase 0.18 metres, the input value into my quantity takeoff sheet would be 19 lengths. I'd have to round that up to the next purchasable length. Now, it could be argued that if you're doing a quote on a job and you say, oh look, I've got a half a sheet of trench mesh left, I'll use that and I'll make it 18, but someone's got to pay for the piece of trench mesh in the first place. So if it goes into the job, it should be paid for. And if it's going to be paid for, it's got to be on the quantity takeoff sheet. So rounding is important. When we get to the slab mesh situation here, if you ring up someone like Newman Steel or Aquila Steel or somewhere and ask them, they'll say that a 6 metre by 2.4 sheet of slab mesh would cover 12.55 square metres of cover of that sheet. So if we took the 150 square metres divided by the 12.55, it yields 11.95 sheets. We just can't go to Aquila Steel and say I want 11.95 sheets. You would have to round it up to 12. So if it's rounded up to 12 and then have its unit rate applied to it, you're being paid, or you can charge the client for what you're needing to buy. So rounding has a very important role to play in the actual arriving at the cost. Waste is also an important consideration here. This is my favourite when I was teaching at TAFE, where people say, oh, how much waste should you allow? Imagine, for an example, you had some formwork set up on a high-rise building. It was for a beam that was 300 wide and 600 deep. You could calculate extremely accurately as to what the quantity of concrete would be that was needed for that particular form, because the amount of waste would be negligible. You might say, look, if I allow 1% for the formwork to creep a bit or someone overfilling a little bit, 1% might be enough. Let me just point out this situation. Here we have a site that's got 2 different sized trenches on it. Same soil type, same width trench, similar breakout, but different depths. When you look at trench A, if the breakout at the top of the trench is exactly the same as B, then the percentage of waste would be different, because the breakout as a percentage of the total quantity required for trench A is different from B. So the percentage of waste needing to be allowed on that first trench would be higher than what it needed to be for trench B. You have an understanding of that? Let me just explain a bit further. If you take the bottom 200 millimetres of each trench, then the waste would be the same, notwithstanding rocks pulling out of the trench. The top 200 millimetres would be the same. But the bit in the middle would be different, because the first one doesn't have that amount of difference. So just be aware that waste can vary from job to job. And different items used within a job would have different percentages of waste.
John, just on your last slide there, how do you incorporate rounding when you're trying to calculate waste?
That gets back to the way you measure. Let me just cover that. I'll cover that for you a little bit later on when we go to the method of how we take off our quantities. You'll notice I'll just go back. You'll notice here that I've said the perimeter is 50 metres. Now, in some computerised CAD systems, they'll use what they call a centre line measurement, which would cover costs as far as the amount of mesh is taken through to the middle, in like whether you come to an external corner and let me just write it up on the board. Okay, take this example here. When we do our measure, the trench mesh would go from end to end, notwithstanding the 50 millimetres cover on the end of the tool, 65 millimetres cover on each end. When we come down here, the same thing applies. With a centerline measurement, they're saying that the double up on this section in here fills in that section up there. But that gives you what's called, what I describe as being a net amount. That will cover the net amount of mesh required, but no waste. My method of measurement is, particularly when we come to internal corners. Now you'll see there that I've said that has got 50 metres of trench, which means that I've used the total external dimension of the building, which when divided by the cover should cover enough waste, considering when I take the rounding mechanism where I'm rounding from 1.18 lengths of trench mesh, beg your pardon, 18.18 lengths to 19 would give me all the waste I need, because I've measured from end to end. I'm allowing for the lapse. However, when I measure a house that's got re-entrant points, I will always measure the overall there, the amount I would take to that corner there, and then I would add the number of re-entrant points by whatever the width of the trench is twice. That allows for all the double re-entries, which then adds the waste. So if I'm measuring precisely what I need and I'm rounding, that should cover the cost and the quantity required. Now, take this particular house here, very different from the previous example of a simple rectangle. Here we have a house that's got re-entrant points. If you look up there near the alfresco where the foundation comes in, over, up, back out, over, and even where the projections are, up there for whatever that is, a family room projection, or down here where you've got the robes projecting here, lots of different lengths to measure. When we do a quantity takeoff, you've got to be logical in the way you approach it, and you've got to be consistent in the way you approach it. So for example, if I was going to do a quantity takeoff simply for the foundations on this particular house, I would look up here and I'd start from the top left-hand corner. You don't have to, but wherever you start, you should use that same starting point for everything that you measure in the house. So for example, I'd start from the top left-hand corner, I'd go across to the first change of directions. I'd measure down, measure over, measure up, measure out, measure up, over, up, down, out, down, in, down, out, down, in, and measure around the house in that fashion. And as I went, I would have a coloured highlighter and I'd put a dot on each section that I had measured. That way, I'm not going to miss any foundation. There's no sense me getting up there measuring that piece of foundation, then coming down and measuring this one, then going over there. Keep it in some logical, progressive format. Now, when you come to things like measuring internal walls, I always start at the top left-hand corner, measure over on every horizontal wall, start at the top left-hand corner and measure every vertical wall. And as I go, tick, tick, tick. If you do it that way, you start up there, go down and over. Or start up the top, over and down. That is the method part of the quantity takeoff. Follow the takeoff in a logical format. Record it as you go.
I keep reiterating what you're telling us is that it is a disciplined method that you must follow, that you put into the process. No matter which one you use, you still follow that process, and it's got to be disciplined.
That's exactly right. That's why they call it a discipline, because it's the way you do it. You've got to set the process and stick with it. You know, if you're left-handed, you might start at the top right-hand corner and work around anti-clockwise. Nothing wrong with that, provided your method is consistent.
What if you got red hair?
Exactly. You're more likely to be the subby's dog. So that's the way I would approach that. Similarly, when you come to things like bathrooms, working out tiles for walls, work around the room, can't go wrong. If you're doing a manual takeoff for skirting, same process. If you record the walls in cut lengths in your quantity takeoff, you say I've got 3.6, another one 5.4 and so forth, you can total up the metres, you can actually get the quantity of skirting from those takeoffs for your wall frames. Separate the external walls from internal walls, separate the load-bearing walls from the non-load-bearing walls. But all to do with method and process. Now, estimating can be a rewarding and fulfilling experience. It can be pretty demanding, depending upon how many jobs you've got to cost up. Don't come home from work tired, have a stubby, watch the news, nod off in front of the TV and then go and expect to do an estimate. You have to give up time and give dedication to what you're doing. If you don't, you're creating problems for yourself. If you're not prepared to be thorough and diligent when you do your estimating, the consequences can be very, very expensive. I can't remember how many times builders have rung me up and said, oh, I'll get you to do this estimate for me. Oh, you do your own, don't you, I'd say. And they say, oh, I forgot the plasterboard in the last house. That can be very, very expensive. Or I forgot the painting or something else. If you can't prepare the estimate in a timely fashion, then perhaps the procedures you are employing need to be changed. You need to adapt to the necessities of what you need to do. That builder I spoke to years and years and years ago said to me, method, John, method, most important. Make sure you work out your methods you're going to use. And he said, and there's no good coming back to him and saying, or someone saying, look, you know, you've got to change your methods. You've got to speed this process up. What's the first thing people say? I don't have time, mate. I don't have time to do that. Well, he said to me, if you don't employ the methods and procedures to save the time you haven't got, you will never, ever, ever save the time. You have to take a stand somewhere along the line. If I go to you and say, how are you going with the estimating? Mate, I'm flat out. I say, well, look, you know what? You've thought about computer software. I haven't got time to learn it. I could go back to that same person 10 years later and they'll still have no time. Unless you change. He said, it doesn't have to be complicated, John. Estimating doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be a procedure you follow. It's like following your tom-tom in the car. Turn left, turn right. That's all you have to do. Have it laid out in procedure. He says, never seek the answer to a simple problem by employing a complex or difficult solution. Keep it simple. Anyone can read. I hope that's been beneficial.
Thanks, John. That was fantastic. Our next presenter, Paul Lawrence. Welcome, Paul.